There is a kind of intelligence officer who does not exist. No file bears their true name. No colleague knows their face. They walk through foreign cities, attend meetings, build friendships, and conduct business under identities so thoroughly constructed that even they, in quiet moments, must remind themselves who they really are. These are MI6's deep cover operatives, officers who surrender their lives not for a single mission, but for years, sometimes decades, living as someone else entirely. This is not espionage as fiction portrays it. There are no car chases, no last-second extractions. There is only the slow, methodical dissolution of self in service of a role that must never crack, never falter, never reveal the truth beneath. The decision to go undercover is not made lightly, nor is it offered to many. MI6 identifies candidates through years of observation, psychological profiling, and operational testing. What they seek is not bravery in the conventional sense. They seek patience. They seek officers capable of enduring profound isolation without complaint, of maintaining behavioral consistency across months and years, of accepting that no recognition will ever come. The ideal candidate is often overlooked in other contexts, someone who does not seek the spotlight, who possesses a natural facility for blending into environments without drawing attention. And even casual acquaintances who might ask the wrong question at the wrong time. Where did you grow up? What school did you attend? What was your first job? These are not simple lies to be memorized. They are layers of believable history, supported by documentation, by references, by a trail of evidence that must exist in the world should anyone choose to look. And they will look. That is the nature of the environments into which MI6 places its undercover officers. Hostile intelligence services conduct their own vetting. Criminal networks test newcomers with suspicion. Corporate environments demand proof of expertise. The legend must not only hold under passive observation, but active investigation. This requires more than documents. It requires the officer to inhabit the role so completely that their reactions, their knowledge, their mannerisms align perfectly with the identity they claim. A British officer posing as a businessman must know the business. They must understand the industry, the language, the cultural norms of the region they operate in. They must be able to discuss technical details, navigate professional relationships, and make decisions that a real person in that position would make. There is no room for hesitation, no moment where the mask can slip. The psychological cost of this work is measured not in dramatic moments, but in the accumulation of small, unrelenting pressures. An undercover officer lives in a state of constant vigilance. Every conversation is a performance. Every relationship is transactional, even when it feels genuine. They make friends knowing they will betray them. They earn trust knowing they will exploit it. And they do this alone. There is no team waiting nearby, no support network to reassure them. What does it mean to live this way? To wake each morning and put on a name that is not yours? To respond instinctively when someone calls you by a false identity? To suppress your own accent, your own preferences, your own memories in favor of a fabricated history. Over time, the boundaries blur. Officers report a strange phenomenon, a sense of detachment from their original selves. The person they were before going undercover begins to feel distant, almost unreal. The role they inhabit becomes more familiar, more natural. This is both necessary and dangerous. The role must feel authentic because it is being tested constantly by those around them. But if the officer loses their anchor, if they forget the distinction between who they are and who they are pretending to be, the psychological consequences can be severe. MI6 understands this. They know that deep cover work exacts a toll that cannot be easily quantified or repaired. They monitor their officers as best they can from a distance, watching for signs of stress, of compromise, of mental erosion. Once an officer is embedded, extraction is a last resort, reserved for moments when exposure is imminent or the operation has achieved its objective. Until that moment, the officer must endure. They must continue performing, continue building relationships, continue gathering intelligence while the weight of their double life presses down on them. Day after day, success in this work is not measured by heroic acts. It is measured by invisibility, by the ability to exist in a hostile environment without raising suspicion, by the slow, patient cultivation of access to people, information, and networks that would otherwise remain hidden from British intelligence. An undercover officer might spend years establishing credibility in a target organization, moving gradually from the periphery toward the center, earning trust through small gestures and consistent behavior. They do not steal documents in the night. They are given access because they have become trusted. They do not force their way into secret meetings. They are invited because they belong. And then, one day, the role is complete. The identity is established. The access is secured. The undercover officer has become exactly who they claim to be. They move through their environment with confidence, their presence no longer questioned. They are, by all appearances, just another face in the crowd, another professional going about their business. No one suspects, no one watches. The operation has reached the point of maximum effectiveness, where intelligence flows naturally, where opportunities present themselves without force. But this is not the end. This is the beginning of the most dangerous phase. The moment when everything they have built is most vulnerable, when a single mistake, a single inconsistency, could unravel years of work in an instant. They are deep inside now, fully committed, with no easy way out. And the real test of their discipline, their resilience, their ability to maintain the illusion under pressure, is about to begin. The routine becomes the greatest threat, not the dramatic interrogation, not the sudden confrontation, but the ordinary interactions that occur day after day, each one a test that cannot be failed. An undercover officer must remember that they are always being observed, even when it feels like they are not. A colleague asking about childhood memories over lunch. A neighbor inquiring about family during a casual conversation. A business associate mentioning a detail about the officer's supposed past that does not quite align with the constructed history. These moments arrive without warning, and their response must be immediate, natural, consistent with everything that has been said before. There is no time to calculate. The legend must have become so deeply embedded in the officer's consciousness that the answers flow, as if they were true memories, not rehearsed lines. What happens to the mind under this sustained pressure? How long can a person maintain the separate identities before the distinction between them begins to erode? MI6 knows that the psychological architecture of deep cover work is fragile. Officers are trained to compartmentalize, to keep their true self locked away while the false identity operates in the world. But compartmentalization is not a permanent solution. It is a technique that requires constant effort, and that effort accumulates into a form of exhaustion that has no external symptoms. The officer appears normal, functions normally, but internally they are managing a cognitive load that never relents. Every social interaction demands dual awareness. What am I supposed to know? What am I supposed to feel? What would this version of me say in this moment? The mental discipline required is extraordinary, and it cannot falter. Loneliness compounds the strain. An undercover officer forms relationships, sometimes close ones. But these relationships are built on deception. They laugh with colleagues who believe they are someone else. They earn the trust of people they are actively betraying. They may even develop genuine affection for individuals in their target environment. And this creates a psychological conflict that has no resolution. To succeed, they must be convincing, and to be convincing, they must engage emotionally. But every emotional connection deepens the deception and makes the eventual conclusion, when it comes, more painful. There is no one to share this burden with, no one to confess the weight of living a lie. The officer carries it alone, knowing that vulnerability is not an option. That any sign of doubt or hesitation could raise questions they cannot afford to answer. Fear becomes a constant companion, not the sharp fear of immediate danger, but the low, persistent fear of exposure. What if someone from their real past appears in their operational environment? What if a detail in their legend is checked more thoroughly than anticipated? What if a photograph surfaces, a document is found, a connection is made that links their current identity to their true one? These are not paranoid fantasies. They are real risks that undercover officers must account for at all times. The world is smaller than it appears, and the probability of chance encounters, of unexpected scrutiny, increases the longer an operation runs. An officer embedded for 5 years faces far greater cumulative risk than one deployed for 6 months. Every additional day in the field is another opportunity for something to go wrong. And yet, the work continues. Intelligence is gathered slowly, carefully, through access rather than theft. An undercover officer does not break into offices or hack computers. They are given information because they are trusted. They attend meetings because they belong. They hear conversations because people speak freely around them. This is the ultimate success of deep cover operations. The target environment treats the officer as one of their own. But this success is also what makes exposure so catastrophic. If the deception is discovered, it is not just the officer who is at risk. It is everyone who trusted them, everyone who shared information with them, everyone who believed they were genuine. The betrayal is total, and the response from hostile actors is rarely measured or forgiving. MI6 understands that the longer an officer remains undercover, the more the false identity takes precedence over the real one. This is not a failure of training. It is an inevitable consequence of prolonged immersion. The officer begins to think in the patterns of their cover identity. They adopt its preferences, its habits, its worldview. They stop translating from their true self to their false self because the false self has become primary. In some cases, this is necessary for survival. An identity that feels artificial can be detected through subtle inconsistencies in behavior, through hesitations that should not exist. But when the false identity becomes dominant, the officer faces a different kind of danger. The loss of their anchor, the erosion of the internal reference point. That reminds them who they actually are and why they are doing this work. There are no scheduled breaks, no moments of relief where the officer can step out of character. Even in private, even alone, the role must be maintained because habits formed in private will surface in public. An accent that slips when tired, a preference that contradicts the cover story, a reaction that belongs to the true identity rather than the false one. These are the small fractures that can grow into fatal inconsistencies. MI6 trains officers to live their legends completely, to eliminate any separation between performance and reality. But this creates a paradox. The more successful the deception, the more the officer loses themselves within it. How does one endure this? What mental strategies allow an officer to sustain a false identity for years without breaking? Some rely on rituals, small private actions that reconnect them to their true self. A particular way of making tea that belongs to who they really are. A piece of music listened to in solitude that predates the cover identity. These are psychological anchors, reminders that the false identity is temporary, that somewhere beneath the performance, the real person still exists. But these anchors must be used sparingly, in moments of absolute privacy, because any behavior that does not align with the legend is a risk. The officer walks a line between maintaining their sanity and maintaining their cover, and the margin for error is vanishingly small. Time works against them. The human mind is not designed for sustained deception. Research into long-term undercover work, though limited, suggests that officers experience a form of identity fatigue, a gradual weakening of the psychological barriers that keep the true self and false self separate. This manifests in subtle ways: slower reaction times when responding to questions about the cover identity, moments of confusion about biographical details that should be automatic, a sense of detachment from both identities as if neither is fully real. MI6 monitors for these signs, but from a distance. With infrequent contact, detection is difficult. The officer must self-assess, must recognize when they are approaching the limits of their endurance, and must communicate this to their handlers through carefully concealed signals. But admitting vulnerability, even to one's own service, feels like failure, and many officers push beyond safe limits rather than acknowledge they are struggling. And so they continue. Days become weeks, weeks become months, months become years. The undercover officer moves through their constructed life with practiced ease, their performance so refined that it no longer feels like performance. They are trusted. They are established. They are, by every measure, exactly who they claim to be. The intelligence flows. The operation succeeds. But beneath the surface, the pressure mounts. The weight of sustained deception, the accumulation of lies, the loneliness of a life lived entirely in service of a role that can never be acknowledged. All of this builds toward a threshold that every undercover officer knows exists, but hopes never to reach. The moment when something breaks, when the carefully maintained equilibrium shifts, and the truth threatens to surface. It begins with nothing, or what appears to be nothing. A colleague who usually greets the officer warmly becomes slightly more reserved. A conversation that would normally flow easily feels careful, measured. Someone asks a question they have asked before, as if testing whether the answer remains consistent. These are subtle shifts, barely perceptible, but to an undercover officer attuned to the social environment, they register as warnings. Is this genuine change a natural fluctuation in human behavior, or is it the beginning of suspicion? There is no way to know for certain, and that uncertainty is itself corrosive. The officer cannot ask directly. They cannot probe without appearing defensive, without drawing more attention to themselves. They can only observe, adjust, and hope that whatever caused the shift will pass without escalation. But what if it does not pass? What if someone has noticed something, some small inconsistency that lodged in their mind and refuses to settle? People are remarkably perceptive when it comes to detecting inauthenticity, even when they cannot articulate what feels wrong. A story that is told slightly differently on two occasions. A reaction that seems calibrated rather than spontaneous. A gap in knowledge that should not exist for someone with a claimed background. These discrepancies may not be enough to prove deception, but they are enough to create doubt, and doubt is contagious. One person shares their unease with another. Questions are asked quietly, informally, in ways that do not yet constitute formal investigation, but that begin to tighten the net around the officer. And the officer must navigate the shifting terrain without knowing how much has been noticed, how much is being discussed, how close they are to exposure. The psychological burden intensifies. Every interaction now carries additional weight. The officer must appear relaxed while internally calculating every word, every gesture, every response. They must project confidence while suppressing the fear that their cover is unraveling. They must maintain the relationships they have built while knowing that those relationships may now be tools of surveillance, that the people who trust them may also be watching them more closely than before. Trust, once given, can be quietly withdrawn without announcement. The officer may still be invited to meetings, still included in conversations, but with a new undercurrent of scrutiny that changes everything. How does one perform authenticity when authenticity itself has become suspect? There are moments of acute danger, incidents that could expose the operation entirely. A chance encounter with someone from the officer's real past, someone who knows their true identity, their true name. The recognition is instantaneous on both sides. But what happens next depends on split-second judgment. Does the officer acknowledge the connection and attempt to explain it away, risking that the explanation will not hold? Do they pretend not to recognize the person, creating a strange social moment that others may notice? There is no protocol for this. There is only instinct, shaped by training, but ultimately reliant on the officer's ability to make the right choice under immense pressure. And even if the moment is navigated successfully, it leaves a residue of anxiety. Who else might appear? What other fragile threads connect the false identity to the true one, waiting to be pulled? The moral dimension becomes harder to ignore. The officer has, by this point, likely formed genuine connections with people in their target environment. They have shared meals, celebrated successes, offered support during difficulties. These relationships, though built on deception, have taken on emotional weight. The people the officer is betraying are not abstractions. They are individuals with families, with ambitions, with vulnerabilities that the officer has come to know intimately. And yet the work continues. Intelligence is extracted from private conversations, from moments of trust that will eventually be weaponized against those who offered it. How does one reconcile this? How does one maintain humanity while engaging in systematic betrayal? Some officers compartmentalize ruthlessly, viewing targets as assets rather than people. Others struggle with guilt that accumulates but cannot be expressed. There is no one to absolve them, no one to whom they can confess the weight of what they are doing. The operation demands it, the mission justifies it, but the human cost remains, borne silently by the officer alone. Time itself becomes an adversary. The longer the operation continues, the greater the cumulative risk. Every additional month undercover is another month where chance, coincidence, or human intuition might uncover the deception. MI6 understands this. They monitor the operation's risk profile continuously, weighing the value of continued intelligence gathering against the increasing probability of compromise. But extraction is not simple. The officer cannot simply disappear without raising immediate questions. Any sudden departure, any abrupt change in behavior will be noticed and investigated. If the officer is to leave, it must be for a reason that aligns with their cover identity, a reason that feels natural and complete. But what if no such reason exists? What if the circumstances of the cover life have trapped the officer in place, where leaving would itself be suspicious? The officer faces an impossible calculation. To continue is to accept escalating risk. To live each day knowing that exposure may come without warning. To withdraw is to potentially abandon an operation that has taken years to establish. To waste the intelligence access that has been so carefully cultivated, and possibly to trigger the very scrutiny they are trying to avoid. And withdrawal itself carries danger. Once extracted, the officer's cover identity may be investigated more thoroughly. Loose ends may be examined. People who trusted the officer may begin to ask why they left, what they were really doing, whether everything they said and did was genuine. The revelation, if it comes, can place not only the officer at risk, but also anyone who assisted them, anyone who might have unknowingly facilitated their access. What does it mean to live suspended between these choices, knowing that neither path is safe? The officer continues to function, continues to perform, but internally they are eroding. Sleep becomes difficult. The constant vigilance required to maintain the cover identity bleeds into every hour, leaving no space for genuine rest. The officer dreams in character, wakes in character, and finds that even in solitude they cannot fully relax because the habits of the false identity have become reflexive. The distinction between the role and the self has collapsed so completely that the officer can no longer easily access who they were before this began. They have become the person they pretended to be, and that transformation, while operationally effective, is psychologically devastating. MI6 knows that every deep cover operation has a terminus, a point beyond which it cannot safely continue. The challenge is identifying that point before it is crossed. Officers are trained to send signals when they feel compromised, but those signals depend on the officer's judgment, and judgment itself can be impaired by prolonged stress and identity fatigue. Some officers fail to recognize how exposed they have become, convinced that they can maintain the illusion just a little longer, just until the intelligence objective is fully achieved. Others become hypersensitive, interpreting normal social friction as evidence of suspicion, seeing threats where none exist. Both states are dangerous. Both can lead to catastrophic outcomes. And so the operation reaches a threshold where every decision is weighted with consequence, where the margin for error has shrunk to nothing, where the officer must choose not between good options and bad options, but between different forms of risk. Do they trust their cover and remain in place, hoping that whatever suspicions exist will fade? Do they signal for extraction and accept the operational and personal costs of withdrawal? Do they attempt to navigate the growing danger through adjustment, through subtle changes in behavior that might address concerns without confirming them? There is no formula for this. There is only the officer's assessment of the situation, their reading of the people around them, their sense of how much longer the deception can hold. They are alone with this judgment, alone in a way that no amount of training can fully prepare them for, standing at the edge of a decision that will determine whether years of sacrifice end in success or disaster. The operation ends the way most intelligence work ends, quietly, without ceremony, often without clear resolution. An undercover officer does not typically experience a dramatic extraction, no urgent escape across borders in the middle of the night. Instead, they simply stop being the person they pretended to be. A resignation from a job that felt natural given manufactured circumstances. A relocation explained by plausible personal reasons. A gradual withdrawal from relationships that, over weeks or months, fades into ordinary distance. The officer disappears not through spectacle but through the mundane mechanics of life changing, of people moving on, of connections naturally dissolving. Those left behind may wonder, briefly, what happened to their colleague, their friend, their trusted associate. But they do not investigate. They do not suspect. They simply accept the story they were given and move forward with their own lives, unaware that the person they knew never truly existed at all. For the officer, this transition is not relief. It is dislocation. After years of inhabiting a false identity so completely that it became primary, the return to their true self is not automatic. They must now remember who they were before the operation began, must reconnect with a name, a history, a set of relationships that feel distant and unfamiliar. The psychological work of shedding the cover identity is as difficult as assuming it was in the first place, perhaps more so, because the false self has had years to solidify while the true self remained dormant. Some officers describe feeling like imposters in their own lives, as if their real identity is now the performance and the cover identity was the authentic one. This reversal is disorienting and, in many cases, permanent. The person who went undercover is not the person who returns. MI6 provides support for reintegration, psychological resources designed to help officers navigate this transition. But the effectiveness of such programs is limited by the nature of the experience itself. How does one process years of sustained deception, of living in a state of constant vigilance, of forming relationships built entirely on lies? The officer cannot speak openly about what they endured, even to therapists cleared to hear classified information, because the details of the operation remain protected. They must discuss their trauma in abstractions, in careful language that conceals as much as it reveals. This creates another layer of isolation. The officer has returned from the field but remains, in a fundamental sense, alone with what they experienced. No one who has not lived undercover can fully understand the psychological cost, and those who have are bound by the same silence. There is also the question of what the officer has become. Years of manipulating others, of exploiting trust, of suppressing genuine emotion in favor of calculated behavior leaves marks that do not fade quickly. Some officers find that they can no longer form authentic relationships because they have trained themselves to thoroughly view every interaction through a strategic lens. They read people reflexively, analyzing motivations, detecting vulnerabilities, operating in social environments as if every person is a potential asset or threat. This is useful in intelligence work. It is corrosive in personal life. Partners, family members, friends sense a distance they cannot explain, a guardedness that never fully relaxes. The officer wants to reconnect, to be present, to love without reservation. But the habits formed undercover resist dismantling. Trust, once weaponized, becomes difficult to experience genuinely. And what of the operation itself? Was it successful? Intelligence agencies measure success in terms of information gathered, networks disrupted, threats identified or neutralized. By these metrics, many deep cover operations achieve their objectives. Intelligence flows. Strategic advantages are gained. National security is, in ways that can never be publicly acknowledged, enhanced. But success, when measured this way, tells only part of the story. It does not account for the human cost, for the officers who sacrifice years of their lives, their sense of self, their capacity for normal relationships, in service of objectives that remain classified and unrecognized. There are no medals, no public acknowledgments, no moments where the officer's contribution is celebrated. There is only the knowledge, held privately and often painfully, that they did what was required and survived it. But survival is not the same as wholeness. Many officers who complete deep cover assignments struggle for years afterward with depression, with identity confusion, with a sense that they have lost something essential that cannot be recovered. They gave themselves to the work completely, and when the work ended, they found that the person they were before no longer existed. This is not failure. This is the reality of what deep cover intelligence work demands. It requires officers to become someone else so thoroughly that returning to who they were is no longer possible. MI6 understands this. They know that the officers they send undercover will not return unchanged. The question is whether the intelligence gained justifies what is taken from those who gather it. There is also the risk that follows officers even after extraction. An identity used for years in hostile environments may be compromised long after the operation ends. Documents surface. Photographs circulate. Former associates realize, sometimes years later, that they were deceived. This creates ongoing danger for the officer, who must live with the knowledge that exposure is always possible, that the past they constructed could still catch up with them. Some officers live under protected identities for the rest of their lives, never fully able to exist openly, always maintaining a degree of operational security even in retirement. Others disappear entirely, their true names erased, their existence known only to a small number of people within MI6, who manage their post-operational care. These are lives spent in the shadows, not by choice, but by necessity, because the work they did precludes normal existence. How many such lives are there? How many people have surrendered their identities, their futures, their capacity for ordinary human connection in service of intelligence operations? That will never be publicly disclosed. The answer is unknowable, and that is by design. The secrecy that protects ongoing operations also erases the human cost of those operations from public awareness. We know that deep cover officers exist. We know that they operate in hostile environments for years at a time. But we do not know their names, their faces, the specific sacrifices they made. They exist in a space between acknowledgement and erasure, essential to the work but invisible in its accounting. This is the true nature of undercover intelligence work. It is not adventure. It is not heroism in any conventional sense. It is sacrifice measured not in dramatic moments, but in the slow erosion of self, in the accumulation of deceptions that cannot be confessed, in the loneliness of carrying truths that must remain buried. The officers who do this work are not seeking glory. They are fulfilling a role that intelligence agencies require but cannot publicly honor. They disappear into false lives, gather information in silence, and return, if they return at all, to a world that does not know what they endured and cannot fully reintegrate them. This is the cost of invisible power, of security achieved through deception, of intelligence gathered by those willing to lose themselves in the process. The question remains, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. How do we measure the value of intelligence when the price is the complete transformation, and often destruction, of the people who gather it? MI6 operates on the assumption that some threats are serious enough, some intelligence critical enough to justify this cost. The officers who go undercover accept this calculation, not because it is fair, but because it is necessary. And when the operation ends, when the cover is shed and the officer attempts to return to a life that no longer fits, the silence continues. No recognition, no explanation. Only the quiet understanding that some forms of service are measured not in what is gained, but in what is lost and can never be recovered. If you found this examination of MI6's deep cover operations compelling, consider subscribing for more intelligence analysis that goes beyond headlines and into the psychological and operational realities of modern espionage. The next exploration will continue examining covert operations, the invisible architecture of intelligence work, and the human cost of decisions made in silence. Power does not always announce itself. Often, it operates through those willing to disappear entirely in its service.